Hello and welcome to the Unique Device Identification webinar series. AIM North America is an alliance enabling the cooperation, development, standardization of AIDC technologies. From barcodes to RFID to IoT, AIM North America is your advocate. Any organization with an interest in data collection is a beneficiary of these efforts. Membership provides an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, develop policies and standards, access market reports, and engage new partners. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to go over. First is the AIM antitrust policy. It's the policy of AIM Inc. to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activities shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. Next is our collaboration or work product policy. This states that committee meetings and presentations are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM's developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Next are a few more housekeeping notes. You will notice that you are muted. You will be muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, you can send those to me at AIM Member Services through the chat dialog option located on the bottom right of your screen. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar presentation. Today, I am here with several industry experts who will provide information on leveraging innovation in the operating room. From left to right, we have Betty Jo Rocchio. Betty Jo has oversight and leadership accountability for 45 hospitals, including one virtual hospital and a nursing and procedural areas across 4 states within Mercy Hospital System. James Chang. Dr. Chang is a professor of medicine and a professor of informatics at Duke University. He is a practicing interventional cardiologist and faculty of the Duke Clinical Research Institute and the Duke Center of Health Informatics. Moderator expert Matthew Mentel. Matt is currently a strategic partner with Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC. He brings to his clients more than 29 years of experience in healthcare. And last but not least, Phil Sales, who is the founder of Summate Technologies, Inc. Phil spent 16 years as a sales rep in the trauma industry, managing all aspects of the supply chain and OR support for healthcare providers. Welcome, panelists.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Good afternoon, I guess.
Morning.
Matthew, I'll let you take over now and explain some of the objectives for today's discussion.
Sounds good. So in our next 45 minutes, we'll talk about a couple things around leveraging innovation in the OR. First, we want to describe how data standards and point of use consumption is evolving in the supply chain in the OR. Next, provide some clinical perspective on how this works and how it drives value. Describing then a framework for the model of care that is driving that performance and the sustainability through optimization of supply chain in the OR, their working relationship and the workflows around it. And finally, provide a look at new technology that's driving standards the last mile and into the sterile field. Dr. Chang?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I would like to start off the webinar with a pretty simple question. Are we there yet? And I think everybody realizes or recognizes the answer to that question is that we still have a long way to go. The journey is an interesting one. If you think back even as recently as a little bit more than a decade ago, in 2009, President Obama signed into legislation the EHR incentive program, which we now commonly refer to as the Meaningful Use Program. And that's resulted in the availability of electronic health record systems in well over 95% of hospitals. In fact, it's approximately 97% of all hospitals in the United States today. We spent $36 billion on electronic systems. The triple aim nominally has been the target, and that is to improve the patient experience, improve patient outcomes in terms of patient population health, and to reduce cost of healthcare. And in fact, there's actually been a 4th element added to the triple aim, which is now termed the quadruple aim, and that's to address or reduce clinician burden. But again, back to my original question, are we there yet? I would suggest to you, and what we're going to try to review with you, is that we are still a long way from the ubiquitous availability of information about devices, the use of UDI, and the implementation in clinical processes of care. And what we hope to expose to you today is an approach to thinking about how to specifically address set mapping of devices in the operating room. Can you have the next slide, please?
So Betty Jo, you know, you and Dr. Chang have been integral to how this gets rolled out in your various organizations. Talk to us about how you've done this type of execution or this type of evolution in your organization.
Well, thanks, Matt. And to take Dr. Chang's kind of thinking here, we started really taking a look at this in most health systems as the triple aim. And then what we realized, we jumped into the middle of this, taking a look at processes, taking standards, and incorporating process work. What we failed to recognize is the culture work that kind of goes along with this. And to Dr. Chang's point, I think it's what has driven us from the triple aim into the quadruple aim, that kind of joy in work and leveraging workflows to make sure that the people who are delivering the results can execute. And to his thought, that magical thinking becomes actual grounded in reality when you can take some of that work and execute on it. And so the true learning organizations today are taking a look at doing this in a way that incorporates that culture and technology piece into the framework. So if you'll move to the next slide, Matt. So taking a look at how you take that magical thinking into actually grounding and execution with workflows and your culture, you need a framework for taking a look at how we're going to take a look at some of the concepts today. As we move through the concepts that we're going to be introducing, if we ground it in this framework, I think we start out, Matt, in the right spot. And Matt, you and I have worked together in a number of different ways. We've driven a lot of true installs, but this is really a way of taking a look at implementation. And I think where most people get tripped up in that magical thinking is jumping straight into that process work.
Yeah,
and so if you back it up, go ahead, Matt.
no, I think that's important, the difference between, you mentioned installation versus implementation, right? And I think we always gravitate toward putting a software in, but not actually implementing it. And I appreciate you mentioning that. Please continue, sorry.
No, go ahead. So you and I have worked on this extensively in the last couple of years, but always backing up and taking a look at structure, right, and how we're going to get the work done. And people bypass this step, but honestly, it makes the work much easier and drives the culture in the right way. So taking a look at structure first is key. And then putting people into the process, then engaging the right people in that conversation is going to be most important. And then, right, Matt, we can drive into that process standpoint. And you might want to talk just a little bit about aligning the process, Matt, and how people execute and what that's done across both of our careers to make it a much more optimized work environment.
Sure, thank you, Betty Jo. So back to what Betty Jo was talking about with structure, getting that structure set up and then getting the people engaged is key. But if you don't have a process aligned on how people execute, then you really can't have success, nor can you hold any degree of accountability or implement a solution. So that people ends up being the next step in that process and really making sure that they can be successful. And then finally, or not finally, then next is the solutions, adopting solutions that reinforce that process and establish sustainability. I think going back to the comment around installations versus implementations, I think many times we put a software in without comprehending the process it's going to support, or worse, we change the process to make it support the technology and the people aren't on board, and hence failure starts there and ends all the way through. And then really going back to accountability. Betty Jo?
Just establishing the clear expectations for what you're trying to accomplish. Very difficult to hold people accountable when they don't have all of these pieces of the puzzle in this framework. And I think what you're going to hear throughout the presentation is how we're going to align these pieces into the framework for leveraging some of the technology, UDI capture, and Dr. Chang's done a tremendous amount of work in Duke to take a look at this. So let's get into the meat of this and take a look at it.
So Dr. Chang, can you talk to us about structure?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. So I want to just re-emphasize a word that Betty Jo has used several times, and that's framework. in order to understand the structure of people, process, solutions, accountability, there really does need to be a clear vision of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. That is the framework for the work that we do and the added responsibilities that everybody listening in, everybody who is going to play this back at some point in time can play, what their responsibilities are for making sure that the component of that framework or the components of that framework that they have direct impact upon get addressed to the best possible way. So I'm a physician, I'm a clinician. I typically take a clinical perspective. And if you look at this particular slide, in the middle section, in the gray section, the question that I asked before, which is, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the framework? Really is expressed, I think, pretty nicely. It isn't just clinical documentation, creating a clinical note in the chart just for the sake of being able to say, I was able to perform this procedure, I was able to implant this particular device, and the patient had a successful procedure. That's really only part of the story. If you think about what it is that we're really trying to accomplish, we're trying to create a learning healthcare system, and that is to learn as we're doing. That learning healthcare system then can create an environment that's conducive to evidence generation, discovery, if you will, science, the understanding of what is the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. For example, in the COVID-19 era, I wish we actually had answers about all of the therapeutics that might be working, but it is something that we have to capture the information around in order to generate the evidence. Once we understand what the right thing to do is, then we can use that information to improve the quality and the processes of care. And specific to the devices arena itself, technology assessment, that is, what's the performance characteristics of those devices? Do they make an improvement in patient outcomes? What are the long-standing consequences of having a device put in? Are there liabilities associated with that? Technology assessment then becomes built into the system. So it really does start with the concept of good data. You need data from the EHR system that is collected naturally and natively. You need data from clinical physician and other clinicians interacting with the electronic health record system to document things. But you do have to have in mind that there is a destination, and that is you want all of this information to have a meaningful role in clinical practice. So the reason I mention all these things is that I don't want anybody in the audience to think, oh, I'm just a vendor, or I am just responsible for supplying information to a regulatory body, et cetera, et cetera. This really is a healthcare ecosystem where everybody has their role. Everybody is a key component or a key player in making sure that we create the opportunities to have good data. All members of the community really do have responsibility and accountability in accomplishing the overall vision. Next slide.
Hey, Dr. Chang. Hey, Dr. Chang, this is Betty Jo. If you go back to that slide just for a second, whoever's controlling it, we hear a lot, especially in nursing today, about clinical decision support tools. And what we see on the nursing side is it's only as good as the data you're collecting to give you real-time information. I'm sure on the physician side, it's the same thing. We struggle around that CDS type of framework, I think, that allows us to become a learning organization. And I think the structure, that database might set us up to become a little bit better at that. But just wondering, in your experience, where you've seen kind of that pay off for physicians making decisions on your side of the world.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more completely. The need for good data, as opposed to what I would call, I hope people appreciate this, the verbal vomit that we typically see in documentation. The differentiation of the two is really what helps identify the opportunities of informatics, of computers and computers in electronic health record systems, and really making a difference. it is really hard to act upon information if it is verbose text. If it is simply just the spittle that individuals create, physicians in particular. I'll also say nursing, our nursing colleagues are there. You might ask why we do it that way. And the reason is because documentation is required. It's part of the tradition of medicine. And our focus, unfortunately, in electronic health record systems is largely on remuneration, is on making sure that we, as healthcare providers, as the healthcare enterprises, actually fulfill the documentation requirements that are imparted upon us by the regulatory bodies, by the payers, et cetera. What we're really talking about here is thinking about how to transform that from a verbal, text-based, verbose-based approach to really thinking about good data, having good data at the point of care, and good data that gets leveraged in multiple different ways. And that's, as you'll see, a theme that I return to a little bit later in the presentation. It's a great question. All right, let me move on then, just to emphasize for those of you who are especially on the manufacturing side or involved with UDI specifically, that this is not just something that the clinicians are asking for, that really there is a long-standing push towards capturing information, especially about devices at the point of care, led by the FDA. This effort spans, although this timeline looks like around a decade, the effort actually spans now nearly 3 decades. The key seminal documents are under the 2012 and 2013 chevrons that you see there, strengthening our national system for medical device post-market surveillance. But I would suggest to you, we are now moving forward under the leadership of the NEST Coordinating Center in the upper right-hand corner, and with continued work from the FDA to begin that journey. And I want to emphasize the word begin, that journey of capturing real-world data at the point of care, especially unique device identifier information vis-a-vis devices, so that we can then enable this brave new world of data flows, clinical decision support, as just mentioned by Betty Jo, and other environments that are enabled by the flow of good data.
Yeah, if I can add on to that, Dr. Chang. So as we think about, the meeting in the middle that occurs here, right? So the data becomes a great mechanism for communication in the supply chain space, especially as we look across the entire pipeline of supply chain, right? So for years as a provider, it's been a managing of the communication toward the distributor and toward the supplier, and then I'd say downstream to the clinician. And this becomes a good mechanism as we build upon it. And Betty Jo, any comment you want to make on that?
Well, Matt, what I will say is supply chain really holds the basis for being a partner in this. But I think what Dr. Chang and you are both talking about is when we talk about a clinically integrated supply chain, this slide to me speaks to how supply chain can help us inform that database through Item Master and other things, but leveraging that barcode. But to leverage that barcode, the clinical front lines have to have that point of use consumption. We have to do something with that barcode. It doesn't magically go from manufacturer or vendor into real world evidence like Dr. Chang was talking about. There are steps in between there for supply chain and your clinical teams that have to be connected that I think you're going to hear throughout the presentation here. I just wanted to make that connection because a lot of people are not doing point of use consumption at the clinical front lines, and it's very difficult to connect all these pieces without it.
Yeah, I think that's really the key point. The environment that we're moving towards is where the old approach of separating, say, nursing from physicians, from anesthesiologists, from surgeons, from supply chain, from any aspect of the environment, of the healthcare environment, those lines are being blurred primarily because the value of the data, especially the movement of that data associated with the patient care, associated with supply chain, associated with device evaluation, the movement of that data becomes that common denominator that allows the enabling of what data can then actually accomplish. So getting back to my starting point, which was, are we there yet? No, we're really just now starting on this journey of using real-world data to generate real-world evidence, again, being led by FDA, the National Surveillance System, the MDIC, the NEST Coordinating Center, all of the representations that you see here on this slide.
It's funny, just to add on to it as we continue on, this all kind of ties to what that definition of clinically integrated supply chain is, and it's that collaborative work across the board. So with that being said in structure, Dr. Chang, you want to talk about people and your perspective of people?
Yeah, so let me do this. Let's move on to the next slide. And the people part of this really starts being front and center when you realize who's actually creating the data that's being demanded by all of the potential consumers. Not that the people themselves aren't potential consumers, but the first thing to recognize is there are a ton of folks that are interested in the data itself. Our focus here is really on UDI and on set mapping, et cetera, but it is the good data that I showed on that slide before, that we showed on the slide before, that has gotten the interest of lots of different peoples, whether you're sending data to registries, whether you're using the data at the health system level for population health. Payers have long been in the business of capturing and requesting data that supports the billing processes, but patients have become a more recent group that really wants to receive information, receive data. I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you on this call, have access to your own patient portal. When you go see your clinician today, the next day or so, you look up your lab results. You look up to see what is normal, what's abnormal, what recommendations are being made to you from your patient, from your clinician. So the question then is, from a people standpoint, if you think about it, if you can just click forward to the next slide. If you think about it, there is a group of folks, that is the clinicians who are, no, I'm sorry, go back, who are producing that information. And all these producers of that information are time challenged, they're short staffed, and they're already overloaded with information with increasing expectations placed upon them. And so really the question, if you think about the structure, people, process, solutions, and accountability metaphor, boils down to what's on the next slide. And that is that how do we think about the capture of information that can supply data to all of those masters, the folks that need the information, but have it integrated cleanly into the processes of care in ways that don't increase clinician burden. In fact, what we're looking for are ways to decrease clinician burden, decrease the work that's being done, decrease the cost, improve the quality of that data, et cetera, and do it in a way that is still allows the clinician, the clinical team, the PAs, the nurses, the respiratory therapists, and obviously the physician, since I'm a physician, I'm taking that perspective, but to let us do our job and to do it the best possible way instead of making us computer technicians.
I think that's a great point around structure, establishing structure, understanding process, but people, excuse me, but again, that clinically integrated supply chain, leveraging the value of that collaborative effort to improve the workflow. Betty Jo?
Well, what I was going to say is some of the users that you talked about, Dr. Chang, on that slide, end users are obviously your CFOs, your presidents of hospitals. They want to see that connection, but it goes through that clinical front lines to be able to make it. So I'm thinking back to meeting with some of our surgeons trying to kind of reduce the variation of care, like you said, and decrease the cost, increase the quality. A lot of times they don't have visibility into any of those data points as they're making decisions for patients. They only get that information maybe a month out after doing surgical cases, and it's really hard, I think, for doctors. To your point here, I love this slide. They're not computers. They can't go back and make those connections. It has to be more of a real-time connection, and the only way to get that is to consume those data standards right there in the moment and be able to connect some of that cost information as well as some of their decision making through being able to see data at point of use right there while you have the patient on the table. So this is a really good slide that I think I'm going to steal and show to some of my doctors, and then talk a little bit about why we do what we do in the ORs today in Mercy. So great slide.
So Dr. Chang, you want to talk to us a little bit about process, understanding the structure, understanding the people. So what's next?
Yeah, so let's now move on to process. As you think about process, and we're going to talk about the details of that process, at least as implemented at Duke here in the next few slides. But the first thing that I want to mention to you is that, again, the framework of what it is that you're trying to improve through process needs to be addressed, or that framework needs to be understood in ways that allow for you to move beyond, for us collectively to move beyond these individual silos of I do this and therefore my job is done, somebody else does that and therefore their job is done. And to how to move beyond just those concepts to one where the integrated solution becomes the approach that's taken. So again, taking the clinician's perspective for generations, if not millennia, the physician's approach to life is that all we need to do is create clinical documentation and then let everybody else figure out what it means and how to accomplish the tasks that need to be done, whether you're talking about your coders for a billing perspective, whether you're talking about your supply chain folks for making sure that a particular scalpel or a particular stent or a hip prosthesis is available. That's somebody else's problem. And what I would suggest to you is that from a process standpoint, the integrated approach really is where we need to drive towards. We need to go beyond clinical documentation, and we actually need to solve for 4 issues in ways that allow for data interoperability. Number 1, the quality of the data has to improve. Number 2, the data availability has to improve. That needs to be available to other systems almost immediately. And you're going to see in the next couple of slides how we accomplish that again at Duke. Number 3, we can't increase clinician burden. We can't ask the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory therapists, the supply chain folks to become computer technicians, to just be putting information into the computer. And in fact, there's a term that's used often that describes the desirable state, and it's a little disparaging, but I'll just go ahead and say it. It's called data exhaust. And so because you have done something, because you are using a barcode scan in a device for a procedure, why don't you use that same data to create the clinical documentation? The documentation will be better because the information about that device is going to be accurate. It's not going to rely upon the memory of the clinician to dictate or to transcribe in other ways, like typing, for example, the information, et cetera. So think about it from the standpoint of how you reduce clinician burden. And then also, we all obviously need to be cognizant of cost. Can improved data quality and availability with reduced clinician burden also reduce cost? The background slide that you see, this graphic refers to registry data submission. And in particular, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's basically where we are right now. Our data is not very high quality. Our data takes a long time to be used. And the way we accomplish the capture of data today is through swivel chair interoperability. That is, somebody looks at the electronic health record, moves their chair or swivels their chair to a second computer, and then enters that information. And we do that for federal reporting. We do that for supply chain management. We do that for clinical documentation. The question is, how do we move from that model to where we need to go? So Matt, if I can have the next slide, please.
You got it.
The next slide then talks about something that should be pretty near and dear, I believe, to everybody's job, if not their heart, here on this particular webinar. But I do want to remind you that it isn't just the action of capturing the UDI that's important. It's in thinking about an integrated way from a process standpoint. The question really is, where could you use that information where do implantable devices appear in electronic health information systems, which then helps you answer the question why the UDI could be a unifying force for moving good data around that supplies the necessary base information from a multitude of purposes, including, as you see here, supply chain, clinical care, procedure documentation, when patients are seen in follow-up, for example, with a pacemaker device for medical device interrogation, not just for medical device interrogation, for a long-term follow-up. If you see a patient in follow-up 3 years after they've had their hip implant, if you know what hip they've had put in, and if they're starting to have trouble, you can do a device surveillance that way. Obviously, billing and claims data. By the way, I think most of you, if not all of you, are aware that the UDI is going to be required sometime in the not too distant future on the ASC X10 forms. Hopefully that workflow will be automated as well. It will be impossible to input a UDI onto a billing and claims form manually and expect 100% accuracy. And then I mentioned also registries. Registries are one of the key ways that professional societies follow patients longitudinally with respect to the devices that get implanted. How is this device information captured right now? Let's just say there's no consistent way to do it. It differs from vendor to vendor. It differs from hospital to hospital. While there are some data defaults in inventory systems, it's mostly manual entry of the lot information, the serial information, the expiration information. And you can see that at scale, this is just not quite a disaster. We're not that bad at it, but it's not, it's inconsistent and perhaps more importantly, really inefficient, which means cost, and potentially erroneous in terms of just simply the transcription of information. So let me go through the next two slides, next couple of slides, and then we can talk about what does the UDI actually enable, at least from a clinician's perspective. So what I wanted to show you now is just illustrate basically what we are doing at Duke. We started the UDI journey for capturing the UDI at the point of care in 2012 with a demonstration that I did with Joe Drozda and the Mercy Health System. That's again where Betty Jo is the Chief Nursing Officer now, so she can reflect on where we are today. But in 2017, which was not that long ago, we finally made operational the capture of the unique device identifier in the cardiac cath labs and in the EP labs. The concept is very simple. That is, as you bring a piece of inventory in and you're going to implant it into a patient, as you can see my assistant here, Aubrey, doing, she just scans it in, then the information goes into the netherworld of electronics. Next slide. But really, when you think about what that means, now we're starting to get to the solutions component of it. And the solution is not just the capture of the UDI information into, at least in our environment, we use Pyxis procedure stations, but the magic is what happens with that data. And at least within the Duke environment, you can see that there are 4 separate key destinations for the UDI data that we have set it up in a way that I would call is a part of the integrated supply chain management approach. So not only does the data get brought into a care coordination engine from, in our particular case, Becton Dickinson, but it goes into the electronic health record, specifically into the device implant table in our Epic electronic health record system. It goes directly into the procedure documentation. And when I say procedure documentation, not only does the UDI appear there, there is metadata associated with the device. So I do not have to remember that I implanted a brand Z 3.0 by 23 millimeter drug-eluting stent. When I create the documentation, because that device gets scanned in, and that's the lower left-hand corner there, you see where it says Lumetics. All that information, including the serial number, the lot number, the expiration data, the expiration date and the UDI, the PI, and the DI go into our Lumetics system. And then we have automated the replenishment process. So we have just-in-time ordering with management of our supply chain that way in ways that reduce the cost of care fairly dramatically. And so when you think about it from a solution standpoint, whether you're on the end of just making sure that the UDI is there and available, or you're talking about, or you're thinking about it from a standpoint of where that information goes, I would suggest to you, it is not just about capturing the information in an electronic system. The real key is, where does that data go? Last slide here, or next slide here.
So Dr. Chang, if we could come back to that slide for a second, I just want to point out, all that system movement is great and important in the solutions, but if you don't have that structure of the data, the right people engaged and how the data moves, to your point, and the process that supports it, the solution in and of itself can't be successful. And I think to go back to the reference back to Mercy and Betty Jo, you've seen something similar in your space. Any other observations that you can reference?
The only thing I'll say is we do this, as Dr. Chang mentioned, in our cath lab and EP labs. We've also taken it into our OR environment, which I would say for supplies, it's kind of a cath lab on steroids. And so it's been really impactful in that OR environment to connect all these systems, right? To pull from the ERP, which is Lawson for us, into a true perpetual inventory management system that we utilize through scanning at the front lines, and then push it straight into Epic, like Dr. Chang talked about they're doing in their cath labs. We are doing the same thing in the OR environment. It's automating, again, the replenishment. It's automating some of the other functions, and it's also helping us with preference cards, which is new and different, which we've looked at as the preference card as just an inventory management tool for a single patient, right? It's kind of been the view, Matt. I think you helped me years ago with that thinking. The other thing we're doing is, and we're going to talk about accountability next, is we're pulling all this data from Epic and our various other systems straight into an analytics platform to help with some of that accountability. So it's an automatic feed straight into an analytics platform that allows us to make better decisions. And we're delivering that through a mobile BI platform on our phone. So our surgeons can literally walk out of our OR and pull up their phone and see what their cost per case was. That's a true connection between what they've done in an OR and automatic gratification. They can see their cost per case and what they used. So it's an interesting connection once you make all those pieces. And it's helped us with our surgeons with our cost and quality right there at the point of care. So it's been a huge journey, and I think Dr. Drozda and Dr. Chang started it, and we're trying to continue it through that OR environment.
So I think that sets the next slide up very well, right? So Dr. Chang, what does it enable? I think you've kind of spoken to it, but please.
Yeah, so to Betty Jo's point, the Duke journey is also into the operating room. I don't mean to shortchange our OR colleagues. In fact, that's where we anticipate even greater benefits than what we saw in the cath lab. The cath lab comment, by the way, does bear just 15 seconds worth of discussion. The cath lab turns out to be a very controlled environment with a much more limited set of devices that are used in that environment, whether you're talking about cath or EP. And so we find that many institutions start their UDI journey in the cath lab and the EP lab environment, mainly because it's much more controlled, and then go to the operating room after success within that environment. So the drivers that we discovered with our cath lab journey and then now into the operating room really are that this integrated supply chain management concept, this integrated supply chain framework really is the way to think about it, because as I've already mentioned, not only do we use it on the clinical side, but we also use it for inventory management, device use attribution, the list of things that you can see on here that really end up allowing us to have good data end-to-end that drives measures that reduce cost, especially from an inventory management system, and enables knowledge, as Betty Jo just mentioned, for example, the return of cost data directly back to the surgeons at the end of their procedures, so they can compare themselves with both themselves in terms of other procedures as well as their colleagues. So all those things are the enablers that a good UDI system allows.
So that sets up the next great conversation. So you've got structure, you've got people, you have process, you have solutions. If you keep them, if you want to keep them aligned, then the next question is accountability.
So let me just talk a little bit about accountability. The 4 tenets of data capture that you see here, this is the work of better part of a decade of trying to figure out how to use electronic health systems, health information systems within healthcare systems effectively, efficiently, and to everybody's satisfaction. And so the themes that I think we've developed here should already resonate, and that's to capture the data once and use it for anything that you can imagine. We've given you, within the UDI context, a number of different key values for that data. You also need to do it at the point of care using a high usability, user-centered workflow integrated system. And when we talk about, in particular, set mapping, which Phil's going to be doing in a few moments, I think that's a great demonstration of high usability environment. You want to use the computers maximally, and you also want to reduce clinician burden. So using the computer to do what it does well, as opposed to forcing physicians and other members of the clinical team to do things just because the computer wants it that way, that's really the wrong way to be thinking about this. You need to be thinking about it from a standpoint of how to use how to create high usability systems that are workflow integrated, where the computers do well what they do, and the clinicians are enabled to do well what they do as humans.
So I think that's, Dr. Chang, to add on from a supply chain perspective, I think we face many of these challenges equally on the supply chain side with regard to multiple sources of data entry or capture, data in and of themselves not having visibility to the point of care, but rather the after effect or in the charges perspective. A lot of times I think we have gravitated in the past toward leveraging the non-computer approach, or having the computer work for us rather than we work for the computer. And I guess, Betty Jo, in your perspective from the nursing clinical side, how are you seeing this piece?
Well, so what's in it for the frontline nurse who actually consumes the UDI, right, through scanning or other modes? It really is about leveraging that data in that barcode to be able to use it to the advantage in the clinical area. And for nurses in an OR, it's about managing the preference cards. So in Mercy today, the OR circulators have embraced the scanning perspective because we have data on the back half that tells us how to clean up our preference cards. I've been in this business 26 years and have been cleaning up preference cards my entire career. And finally, we have a solution that leverages that data to tell us what to take on and put off that preference card to be more accurate for our surgeons. And so utilizing it in that way, it takes the burden off the clinician of having to run out of the room so many times looking for items that should have been on the preference card in the first place. So they're happy to do it. They've learned all about barcodes in Mercy in the OR environment, and they know which barcode they need to scan to get the information quickly and move it into the record. So it's been a win-win here, and mainly through preference card accuracy, which I'm sure, Matt, helps on the supply chain side because you're not putting away so many items.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. In the collaboration between all aspects of the delivery of care does begin to identify opportunities to reduce that burden of putting information to a system, but sharing information across all platforms. And one of the things in the whole concept around the clinically integrated supply chain is getting the point of consumption closer to the people actually consuming. And in the past, it has been supply chain giving a expensed product to the OR. They use it, really having visibility to what was used other than what was documented in the medical record, and usually via the preference card, and then what shows up in charges after the fact. And as we've implemented scanning solutions, I think it's a great segue into the conversation around the last mile. And Phil, we've saved the best for last, so to speak. You want to talk to us about the last mile and really getting closer to that clinical delivered care?
Okay, thanks, Matt. Just to talk a little bit about non-steriles. Implants, as I think you all know, orthopedic implants come in two flavors. Sterile implants, which come to the hospital sterile in a package and can be labeled, and then non-sterile implants. Non-sterile implants comprise mostly spine, trauma surgery, CMF, and also sports medicine. And they are taken out of their packages and put in sets and trays and sterilized at the hospital. They lose all their tracking data when they are taken out of their package. There's a challenge with scanning these parts and pieces because direct part marking, which is putting the barcode on the item itself, is a real challenge. It's been a technical challenge, although there's been a lot of progress made in that area. But the very nature of these non-sterile implants, in which there's literally hundreds of millions of data points out there, there's hundreds of millions of implants out there that have not been marked. They are at random, unknown locations. They're in trunks of cars, basements, forward service locations, hospitals. They're wrapped up, sort of untouchable. Most are not marked. There are some that are. And there are a lot of really small parts. Again, there's been progress made in direct part marking these implants, but you're trying to control an environment that has hundreds of millions of data points where most of them, the items are not marked. So what we've done with set mapping is it's sort of an interim step that is much more controlled. And what we're doing is we're marking the trays. And in doing that, the tray itself is a known location. It's a small controlled environment. We can also do the instrument locations as well. And we have a unique technology that we've employed, which relies on laser scanning as opposed to optical scanning. Surgical assets undergo a lot of heat, steam. The trays and implants get stained. They're very bright. They can be difficult to read under OR lights. And the scanning technology we have employs a laser scanner, which you can see in the picture there, which has to be placed in close proximity to the tag, in which the item is mapped to. So think of set mapping as shelf tagging. When you go to the grocery store and you look at a shelf, you'll see rows of items and there's a tag right underneath the item that corresponds to that item. Well, we're doing the same thing with the existing sets and trays that are in the field so that they can be scanned, the items can be scanned. We're tracking device information. We are not, by the laws of nature here, we can't scan the production information with the implants. Next slide. So one of the things that set mapping does offer, though, is a data advantage. Set mapping, when it's being set up, is inherently an inventory managed process at its core. So what you're doing is taking a snapshot of your assets in the field, not only at the part level, but at the tray level. I was a device rep for 16 years, and one of the things that the device industry suffers greatly from is a lack of inventory control and also asset management control for things that are in the field. And so what set mapping does is it yields very valuable inventory management data that direct part marking does not necessarily provide. And the data is very valuable for the device OEMs. As I mentioned, it does not track serial information. However, set mapping is a step on the way to sort of the gold medal solution, which would be to scan all of the information, device identifier plus production identifier, off the actual implant itself. But set mapping, as it's set up, doesn't necessarily put you in a box where you couldn't scan the device information directly off the part. We just care that it's a number on our software. And lastly, an advantage with set mapping is because of the value of the data and the asset management data that we can collect, we can take more of a carrot versus a carrot approach to solving the problem and working with the device OEMs versus sort of a regulatory stick, saying you have to do this, here's the deadline, and you got to do it. What set mapping can do is, by delivering data to the device OEMs, is deliver them a carrot to participate in the overall solution. Next step, please. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to, set mapping is kind of a new concept. It was covered in the GS1, had done a paper a year and a half, 2 years ago, they released it, which sort of went over this whole problem of non-steriles in the operating room. And one of the solutions, they said it's going to be a multi-solution type of end goal. And one of them was, in fact, set mapping. So set mapping enables scanning at your point of use in the sterile field. It has a very optimized workflow. And if you look at how our software works, the surgical technician not only scans the implant usage as they're moving along in the case, just as they would record their implants. There's absolutely no difference in the workflow. They can also track the disposition of the implants from the position of the sterile technician. So we have some IP surrounding this, but the sterile technician can also designate whether the part was wasted or returned to the tray. It's a more efficient use of nurse time. Because of this, the circulating nurse does not have to be involved in any process or any type of time investment in tracking the implants. She can take care of the patient. Again, supply chain benefits for the OEMs. And this is an important part here. We can do this now. So this process can be done, set mapping can be done on an account by account basis now. In fact, we're participating with Duke and Mercy on running some pilots. And it's an intermediary step for direct part marking scanning if that becomes feasible at some point in time. And the other piece of this is with our system, we have a data cart that goes with this. We're cloud software. We could operate off of a screen on a boom arm. But this reduces the reliance of having to have the rep involved in the operating room in a post-COVID world. A lot of responsibility, what the rep does is counting the implants. But set mapping also assists on the back end. So sterile processing, when they're rebuilding and restocking the tray, set mapping is a very, in addition to our software, it can be very useful for the actual hospital to implement this function of restocking and reassembling the tray with 100% accuracy via scanning. So basically, we're removing some of the involvement of the sales rep in the OR and in the sterile processing department at the hospitals, and giving the hospitals better control over their own supply chains.
Well, thank you for the last mile and getting us there. Betty Jo, I'd like you, if you don't mind, if you could bring us home.
Sure. So, Phil, I just want to say, and I'm sure Dr. Chang can attest to this, what goes on in the ORs today with non-sterile implants is nobody would call it a great process. It's a little bit of I like to say, a hot mess. When you take a look at the orthopedic procedures, and sometimes there's up to 20 to 30 screws and plates going in a big trauma situation. Today, it's largely a manual process of the scrub tech or the vendor calling out to the circulator to type in all those numbers. And you heard Dr. Chang talk about the amount of errors we get today in just some single implants. If you can imagine what this looks like with 20 or 30 at a time, you could see why Dr. Chang and I are interested in the addition of this technology into the environment to make that connection of that last mile. So it's the first technology that we've seen that is more automated and can directly connect straight into that circulator's EMR that she's using. So it's interesting. I think it also involves the scrub tech in leveraging some of this, which is important for them. And so if you're completing that accountability circle in real world data, being able to produce some of that, I think this will be one of the pieces that becomes important in Dr. Chang and Dr. Drozd's research. So it's an interesting, great new concept. Appreciate you presenting it today. All right, the last thing we want to talk about is wrapping up what we heard today, the framework that we used, and how it makes everything sustainable. So we heard Dr. Chang talk a bit about the fundamentals of this with structure, people, the process, the technology. We heard a bit about some new leveraging last mile technology, and then that accountability structure or that feedback loop. We talked today about strategic alignment, some of the change management processes that are involved in it for physicians, supply chain, our nurses, as well as our vendor partners are going to have to get on board with some of these changes, and how we may be able to leverage this really framework to drive performance and outcomes, not only just for us and our individual organization, but we heard Dr. Chang make the connection between taking that data set out of our own individual hospitals or health systems and taking it to a more global level to be able to drive change. And I think that's going to become more and more important as we take a look at leveraging quality, cost, and outcomes for our patients. How do we make it sustainable? It really is through use of the automation and the technology in that feedback loop to drive where we're going. And hats off to really Matt today for talking about how the supply chain connection comes in, and Dr. Chang connecting it to really someplace larger than ourselves where we're going here today, and Phil for developing that last mile solution to be able to connect that last bit of technology into our environment. So thank you for your participation today, and this was just a great presentation, and you heard it from all different perspectives today.
Thank you, Betty Jo. I guess the next question is, any questions? And Mike, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Appreciate it, and appreciate all our panelists here today for their expert opinions. It was really good, and we do have some questions if everyone's ready for that here briefly. On one of the slides, there was a 1D split barcode. How are both barcodes handled?
Who's the question to?
I'm trying to think of what slide that was on.
There's this, you're talking about the slide on slide 15? The concatenated linear 128, that one?
See if we can get back there and take a look at it. Matt, you might be best to talk to the actual barcode. You were Dr. Chang, right? I'm out of my swing space.
So can you repeat the question, Mike?
It was a 1D split barcode that I guess you had shown, and they were wondering how are both barcodes handled. And it was actually the next slide where the nurse is scanning.
Oh,
there you go. Yep. Well, from an OR environment, I will tell you the amount of barcodes that are on product is, it's a stumbling block for us at point of use consumption. And the way we get around it today is obviously your scanner matters, right? What scanner, what technology you're using. But if there is a G10, we prefer that. So we are teaching nurses what barcodes to look for on products, which is not ideal, but it's the only way we have today of getting around the multiple barcodes. We have some products that have literally 8 or so barcodes on them, and so the nurse over time gets used to looking for the G10 if it's there and using that barcode, and then they go down kind of their decision tree on what barcode they're looking for next. So the nurses can speak to barcodes. They literally have had an education around it, and that's how we get around it today. Hoping someday, right, the research that Dr. Chang and everybody are doing will have the vendor community really standardizing the barcode process. And I think there's several groups out there working on it. But Dr. Chang might have different information.
No, Betty Jo, what you just described is exactly what we do at Duke. There is training of the staff required to make sure that they are barcode scanning in the correct UDI with the barcode scanners. Now, with set mapping, it really goes away because there's only one place where you scan it, and Phil can chat about that. But the only parenthetical I would add is that we actually have had discussions with FDA as to whether to change the regulations so that it actually, the UDI that would be, that is the UDI, is identified as such in either a different color or letters or something like that. Suffice it to say that those discussions are still ongoing. Anything that the manufacturers can do to help identify specifically the UDI would obviously be helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Another question we have is, are there concerns with the security of the data? Are you utilizing blockchain or some way to, I guess, kind of make it more difficult to for someone to jump in and be able to get that data?
So Matt, if you just go forward 2 slides, so slide number 17 or slide number 6, I'm sorry, 1 slide, slide number 17, I'll try to answer that. So these systems that are described here are literally behind the firewall. And so with that, there is a degree of security, and that's automatically imparted because of the way that systems are connected or interconnected within healthcare organizations. Blockchain is probably more useful when data leaves a firewall or a protected environment, and because we are using the information internally, at least at this in this illustration primarily, we have not implemented blockchain. Now, when we send information outside of the enterprise, there's all kinds of security measures that are put into place. Blockchain is one of the technologies that we've played with, but it is actually not something that has become, I would call, a healthcare industry standard yet for moving data around.
Interesting. This next question is directed toward Betty Jo, and it is, what are the differences with data sharing, or are there differences with data sharing in a virtual hospital setting and a brick hospital?
You know what? No, there really aren't. Really, when you think about it, we're doing the same processes. There's a little bit more of a secure connection that needs to occur between the technology that we use in the virtual care hospital and the one going into the home environment. So there's some different firewall and security measures for PHI. But once it hits into Mercy in that virtual hospital, it's managed the exact same way. It goes into the same systems. We're collecting it in the same way. We're arranging the informatics platform in the same way to be able to leverage and give good, useful information to our clinicians. So it's really just that firewall and that secure connection that occurs between virtual and home, the home environment. We also use the virtual capabilities between the virtual hospital and our actual inpatient hospitals to assist nursing and physicians in decision making. Just an extra set of eyes and ears kind of on patients and hospitals. So between those connections, there's absolutely no difference when it's behind the firewall in Mercy. But outside, there are just some security measure differences. But otherwise, we use it in the exact same way. Good question.
All right, thank you, Betty Jo. For the Q&A session, I will end that now. We do have a few other questions. If it's okay with the panelists, I will send those questions to you. I have the commenters' names as well, and I can get in touch with them.
That'd be great.
Great, thank you.
Perfect.
All right, thanks for everyone for staying on the call here today. Appreciate the information. Again, Phil, James, Betty Jo, Matt as well, and I appreciate you, Matt, being our moderator here. Did a great job, and once again, appreciate the audience for their active participation today. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.